Hey, what's up everyone? Today, I'm taking you on a journey you probably never thought about before, the story of the fork and spoon. Two of the most ordinary things on your dining table, but behind them lies a history of power, culture, and centuries of change. From ancient kings and queens to everyday families, these little tools have shaped the way we eat, live, and connect. So sit back, relax, and let's dive into the history of the fork and spoon. When we think of eating today, we take our utensils for granted. A fork, a spoon, and sometimes a knife, they are always waiting for us on the table. But for most of human history, these tools simply didn't exist. People used what they had, their hands, sharpened stones, seashells, wooden sticks, or even animal bones. And it worked well enough, until civilization began to demand something more refined. Long before the fork and spoon were invented, humanity was already shaping objects to help with eating. Archaeologists have discovered that as early as 500,000 years ago, prehistoric humans were using sharpened stones to cut meat. They weren't utensils in the modern sense, but they were the very first step toward creating dining tools. In ancient caves, scientists have also found shells that were used to scoop water and soft food. Imagine a small family sitting by the fire, roasting meat, and one of them using a clamshell to scoop hot broth. That simple act was the ancestor of the spoon. As humans learned to farm and cook, the need for better tools grew. Early farmers in Mesopotamia and Egypt carved small spoons from wood and bone. These spoons were often very simple, flat pieces of wood with a rounded end. Yet, for those people, they were revolutionary, because eating with a spoon meant you could enjoy soups, porridges, and liquids without burning your hands. Meanwhile, in other parts of the world, people relied on chopsticks. In China, as early as 1200 BCE, wooden sticks were used not just for cooking, but also for eating. Instead of scooping, they picked and lifted food. The spoon existed there too, but chopsticks became a cultural icon of East Asia. The fork, however, was missing from this story. For thousands of years, humanity ate without it. Hands, spoons, knives, chopsticks, these were enough. The fork was waiting quietly in the shadows of history, not yet ready to join the table. Spoons in ancient civilizations. The earliest spoons that look somewhat like modern ones come from ancient Egypt. Archaeologists have uncovered spoons dating back over 3,000 years, made from ivory, wood, and even precious metals. But these were not everyday items. They were decorated with hieroglyphics, religious symbols, and images of gods. To hold a spoon in Egypt was to hold a sacred object. Many spoons were used in temple rituals, not in kitchens. They carried perfumes, ointments, and offerings. Imagine a priest dipping a spoon into holy oil before presenting it to the gods. Eating with such a spoon was rare, food for the gods, not for men. In Mesopotamia, spoons made of clay have been found in burial sites. This suggests that spoons were valuable, perhaps symbols of status. In death, as in life, a person might need to eat, and the spoon would follow them into the afterlife. The Greeks and Romans also used spoons. The Romans had a utensil called the cochlear, a small spoon with a pointed handle. The pointed end could pick snails and shellfish from their shells, while the rounded part scooped sauces and broths. Roman banquets, famous for their luxury, relied heavily on spoons. But notice something strange, even here, in these great civilizations, the fork was still absent. Romans used knives and spoons. They used their hands. Sometimes, they used bread as a tool, tearing off a piece to scoop food. But a fork with prongs? That idea had not yet arrived. Why hands were enough? To understand why the fork took so long to appear, we must remember one thing: hands were considered natural, noble, and even divine. In many cultures, eating with your hands was not dirty, it was normal. In India, eating with the right hand was, and still is, considered pure, a way to connect with food spiritually. In the Middle East, hands were used to share from a common dish, a sign of unity. In Europe, bread acted as a universal tool. People dipped it into stews, scooped sauces, and carried meat. So, the spoon was accepted because it solved the problem: how to drink hot soup or stew. But the fork? Nobody saw the need. Meat could be cut with knives. Vegetables could be picked by hand. Bread did the rest. For centuries, the fork was not just unnecessary, it was unimaginable. The sleeping fork. The first forks did exist in the Byzantine Empire, around the 7th to 9th century CE. They were small, two-pronged tools, used mainly for serving food, not eating it. Byzantine nobility used them to spear chunks of meat from platters. But the idea of putting such a tool into your mouth was strange. When a Byzantine princess married into the Venetian royal family in the 11th century, she brought forks with her. The Venetians were shocked. One clergyman even called it a sin against God, saying, "God gave us fingers to eat with. To use forks is to insult his design." This scandal shows how deeply culture resisted the fork. It was seen as foreign, unnecessary, even arrogant. For hundreds more years, most Europeans rejected it. Meanwhile, the spoon grew stronger. While the fork struggled, the spoon thrived. In medieval Europe, spoons became more common, made from wood, pewter, or bone. Families often had one spoon per person, passed down through generations. To own a silver spoon was a sign of wealth. That's where the phrase "born with a silver spoon in your mouth" comes from. Children were baptized with silver spoons, nobles gave them as gifts, and kings displayed them as treasures. The spoon was no longer just a tool, it was a symbol of family, faith, and fortune. The story of the fork is not just about eating. It is a story of culture, religion, resistance, and finally, acceptance. In 11th century Venice, a wedding shocked the city. The Byzantine princess Theodora Ducana married Domenico Selvo, the Doge of Venice. She arrived with gold, jewels, silks, and something strange: a set of golden forks. At her wedding banquet, she refused to touch food with her hands. Instead, she used the fork, delicately, gracefully, as though it was the most natural thing in the world. But the Venetians whispered. They stared. And soon, the clergy began to condemn her. St. Peter Damian, a powerful churchman, declared, "God in his wisdom gave man fingers with which to eat. But this woman, as if she were wiser than God, dares to use a golden fork. This is an insult to the Almighty." When the princess died young, her critics claimed it was divine punishment for daring to use the fork. The fork is a sinful tool. For centuries after, the fork carried this stigma in much of Europe. To many people, it was foreign, unnatural, even demonic. Imagine a peasant family in medieval France, tearing bread with their hands, sipping stew from wooden bowls. What need would they see for a sharp little stick with prongs? Knives and spoons already served every purpose. Knives cut meat, spoons scooped soup, and hands did the rest. A fork looked unnecessary. Worse, it looked arrogant. It separated the eater from the food, as if they were too refined to touch what God had given. Italy leads the way. Yet, Italy did not forget. In the wealthy cities of Venice and Florence, the fork slowly began to spread, first among nobles, then among wealthy merchants. By the 14th century, forks were more common in Italian courts. The reason was partly practical. Italians ate a lot of pasta, and forks were perfect for twirling noodles. By the 16th century, travelers to Italy noticed this difference. An Englishman named Thomas Coriat wrote in 1608. The Italians always use a little fork when they cut their meat. The reason is that they will not touch it with their fingers, which they say is a filthy habit. When Coriat returned to England and used a fork at the table, people laughed at him. They mocked him so much that they called him furcifer, Latin for fork-bearer, but also an insult meaning scoundrel. The fork was still seen as strange, foreign, even laughable. But Italy kept using it. And slowly, the idea spread. France falls in love. The turning point came in France. Catherine de Medici, an Italian noblewoman, married King Henry II of France in the 16th century. She brought with her chefs, recipes, and, of course, forks. At first, French courtiers resisted. But Catherine was powerful, and her influence changed French dining forever. With her came not just forks, but the entire Italian style of etiquette, table manners, and fine dining. By the 17th century, the French court had adopted the fork as a symbol of refinement. Where France went, Europe followed. England holds out. But not everyone was quick to surrender. In England, forks were still rare in the 17th century. King James I himself mocked them, saying they were effeminate and unnecessary. Yet, little by little, the fork made its way in. The growth of trade, the influence of travelers, and the prestige of French manners convinced the English elite to adopt it. By the 18th century, the fork had become normal across Europe. The spoon's steady roll. While the fork fought for acceptance, the spoon continued to thrive quietly. Silver spoons became heirlooms. Wooden spoons were used by common folk. In monasteries, spoons symbolized humility and service. In royal palaces, they symbolized wealth and ceremony. Together, fork and spoon finally began to appear side by side on European tables. But the journey had been long and painful, especially for the fork. What this meant for society. The acceptance of the fork was more than a dining habit. It represented a shift in values. Eating with fingers meant closeness, community, and tradition. Eating with forks meant refinement, distance, and control. To adopt the fork was to embrace a new kind of civilization, one where manners mattered as much as food itself. Imagine a great hall in 12th century England. A fire blazes at one end, banners hang from the rafters, and long wooden tables stretch across the room. Men and women sit side by side on benches. On the table, there are trenchers, thick, flat pieces of stale bread that serve as plates. Bowls of stew and roasted meat lie in the center. Everyone reaches in. This was the reality of medieval dining. The trencher, bread as plate. The trencher was perhaps the most important dining tool of the Middle Ages. It was a block of hardened bread, sometimes cut from yesterday's loaf, sometimes baked especially for this purpose. Food was piled onto it: meat, vegetables, sauce. After the meal, the trencher could be eaten if it had soaked up the juices. If not, it might be given to servants or the poor. In this way, bread was not just food, but also a tool, a plate and sponge combined. Knives at the table. The knife was the king of the medieval table. Every man carried his own, often in a sheath at his belt. At banquets, hosts provided large carving knives to slice meat, but diners cut their portions themselves. Knives were not just for eating. They symbolized masculinity, independence, and readiness. To sit at a feast with your knife was to show you belonged. To be without one was shameful. Guests would sometimes share knives, but never casually. Sharing was an act of trust. A knife was as personal as a sword. The role of the spoon. The spoon was the gentle companion to the knife. Used for stews, porridges, and soups, spoons were common in every household. Poor families carved wooden spoons. Nobles owned pewter or silver ones. Many people carried their spoons with them, just as they carried knives. A child might be given a spoon at baptism, often made of silver, symbolizing a blessed and prosperous life. That tradition gave us the phrase, "born with a silver spoon in one's mouth." No forks yet. Notice what's missing: the fork. In medieval Europe, forks were still rare and foreign. People saw no reason for them. After all, hands could tear bread, knives could cut meat, spoons could scoop stew. Why complicate things? Even at royal banquets, where gold and silver dishes glittered under candlelight, guests ate with fingers, knives, and spoons. Meat was picked up by hand or speared with the tip of a knife. Stew was scooped with bread. The fork had no place yet. Manners and etiquette. But manners were not absent. Medieval etiquette books reveal a surprising concern for politeness. Guests were told, "Do not lick your knife. Do not dip meat directly into the communal sauce. Do not use your spoon twice in the same dish. Wipe your mouth before drinking from the shared cup." Eating was communal, and rules ensured harmony. A lack of manners could ruin your reputation as surely as a lack of wealth. Dining in castles versus villages. In castles, feasts were grand. Musicians played, servants hurried, wine flowed. Dishes of venison, swan, and boar were carved before guests. Yet even here, spoons and knives dominated. In villages, meals were simpler: bread, cheese, pottage, a kind of thick stew, maybe fish or small game. Wooden spoons and clay bowls were common. Knives were used for everything: food, work, even defense. The contrast was huge, but the tools were the same. Only the quality differed: wood for the poor, silver for the rich. The cultural meaning of hands. Eating with hands carried deep meaning. To touch bread, to break it and share it, was sacred. In Christian ritual, bread symbolized the body of Christ. To handle food directly was natural and holy. Thus, when the fork appeared, it seemed to insult tradition. It placed distance between hand and food, between human and divine. This is why the fork was resisted so strongly in the Middle Ages. The Middle Ages had ended. Europe was waking up. The Renaissance brought new art, new science, and new ways of living. It also brought new ways of eating. Italy becomes the fork's first champion. In the 15th century, Italy was alive with trade, wealth, and culture. Cities like Florence, Venice, and Milan were not just rich, they were trendsetters. Fashion, music, art, manners, all flowed from Italy into the rest of Europe. And in the middle of this cultural explosion, the fork began to shine. Why Italy? The answer was simple: pasta. By this time, pasta was becoming a staple of Italian dining. Long strands of noodles, slippery with sauce, were nearly impossible to eat with just a knife or spoon. The fork, with its prongs, was the perfect solution. Italian nobles began to use forks regularly. They were not yet common in every household, but at banquets of the wealthy, forks glittered alongside knives and spoons. And once nobles embraced them, etiquette followed. Manners become power. The Renaissance was not just about eating, it was about showing status. To eat elegantly was to prove refinement. Books of manners and etiquette spread across Europe, teaching people how to sit, how to speak, how to hold a cup, and how to use new tools. Using a fork became a mark of sophistication. To eat with hands or just a knife was now considered common. For nobles, the fork was not only useful, it was a weapon of class. France learns from Italy. The fork's greatest victory came through marriage. In 1533, the Italian noblewoman Catherine de Medici married King Henry II of France. When she arrived in Paris, she brought her Italian cooks, her recipes, and her silver forks. At first, the French were skeptical. They mocked the little pronged tools. But Catherine was powerful, and her court soon became the center of French fashion and dining. With her influence, the fork began to spread. By the late 16th and 17th centuries, the French aristocracy embraced forks completely. French chefs refined dishes that required delicate handling, sauces, pastries, vegetables cut into fine pieces. Eating with a fork became a sign of elegance. England still resists. Across the Channel, however, the English were slow to accept. When travelers like Thomas Coriat brought forks back from Italy in the early 1600s, people laughed at them. Fork users were ridiculed as pretentious. Even King James I sneered, calling forks effeminate. But France's influence was powerful. By the 18th century, even England surrendered. Forks became part of every formal meal. The struggle was finally over. The spoon remains the faithful companion. Through all this, the spoon never left the table. In the Renaissance, spoons became more elaborate. Goldsmiths and silversmiths crafted ornate designs, engraved with family crests. To give a spoon as a wedding gift was considered a blessing. Together, fork and spoon began to appear as a pair, often in matching sets. For the first time, the table looked familiar to us today. Symbolism of change. The rise of the fork was more than a dining habit. It symbolized the birth of modern manners. No longer was eating just about survival. It was about culture, class, elegance, and control. Hands had once been sacred. Now they were unclean. The fork had changed the very meaning of eating. By the 18th century, the fork and spoon had conquered most of Europe. But the world was far larger than Europe. Across Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, different traditions ruled the table. Some welcomed the fork and spoon. Others ignored them completely. Asia, chopsticks versus spoons. In China, chopsticks had been used for more than 3,000 years. They were elegant, efficient, and deeply cultural. The Chinese diet, rice, vegetables, small pieces of meat, fit chopsticks perfectly. A fork was unnecessary. Spoons existed too. In fact, the Chinese ceramic soup spoon, with its flat bottom and short handle, was unique and effective. But forks? Rare, even unwanted. In Japan, chopsticks were sacred, tied to Shinto and Buddhist traditions. Using them was almost spiritual. A fork looked crude compared to the delicate beauty of chopsticks. Even today, Japan embraces chopsticks, though spoons appear for soups and desserts. In Korea, the story was different. Koreans adopted a unique style, metal chopsticks and spoons together. A spoon for rice and soup, chopsticks for side dishes. This pairing shows that even without the fork, the spoon found a permanent place. So across East Asia, the fork never took root. Chopsticks and spoons reigned supreme. The Middle East, hands and hospitality. In the Middle East, eating with hands was, and still is, a tradition of honor. Sharing food from a central dish symbolized family, unity, and hospitality. Bread, especially flatbread, was the universal tool. It scooped stew, carried meat, and soaked up sauces. Spoons were common too, used for soups, yogurt, and broths. Wealthy households owned silver spoons, poorer ones used wood or clay. But the fork remained an outsider. Even as Europeans colonized parts of the Middle East, traditional dining continued. Hands, bread, and spoons were enough. India and South Asia. In India, eating with the right hand was, and remains, a sacred act. Food is seen as a gift from the earth, and to touch it directly creates a bond between body and spirit. Spoons existed for soups or desserts, but forks were rare until the colonial era. The British introduced forks to India, but even then, most families preferred their hands. Today, urban India uses forks and spoons widely, but millions still choose the traditional way. Africa, diversity of dining. Africa's vast cultures had diverse traditions. In many regions, hands were the primary tools, with bread, millet cakes, or injera, in Ethiopia, acting as scoops. In North Africa, influenced by Islam and the Mediterranean, spoons were common for stews like tagine and harira. But forks were not central until colonial influence spread them. In sub-Saharan Africa, communal dining remained important. A shared bowl, eaten with hands, symbolized trust and unity. The fork and spoon entered gradually, but tradition remained strong. The Americas, a new world for fork and spoon. When Europeans colonized the Americas, they brought forks and spoons with them. Indigenous peoples already had tools, wooden ladles, shells, knives, but soon European utensils spread across colonies. In North America, English settlers brought their habits. At first, colonists used knives and spoons. But as forks became fashionable in Europe, they crossed the Atlantic too. By the 18th century, forks were common in American homes. In South America, Spanish and Portuguese influence carried forks and spoons into cities. Yet in rural areas, hands, gourds, and wooden tools continued. Symbol of colonial power. As forks and spoons spread, they became symbols of European influence. Missionaries, merchants, and governors insisted on them as marks of civilization. To eat with hands was seen, unfairly, as backward. This attitude reshaped dining traditions worldwide. In schools, courts, and colonial offices, forks and spoons became mandatory. But in homes, traditional methods endured. The 18th century had crowned the fork and spoon as essential tools of European dining. But they were still luxuries. Silver spoons, finely crafted forks, elegant table sets, these belonged to the wealthy, the noble, the aristocrats. For the common farmer, the poor villager, or the factory worker, eating still meant wooden spoons, a knife, and bare hands. Then came the Industrial Revolution. Factories transformed the table. By the 19th century, machines were reshaping the world. Textiles, steel, and steam were changing how people worked, traveled, and lived. And among these revolutions was a quieter one, the mass production of cutlery. In Sheffield, England, steel factories began producing forks and spoons on a massive scale. No longer carved by hand or forged one by one, utensils could now be stamped, molded, and polished in thousands. What had once been luxury became affordable. Middle-class families bought full dining sets. Even working-class homes could own forks and spoons. The table was democratized. The rise of stainless steel. Another breakthrough came in the early 20th century, stainless steel. Discovered in 1913 by Harry Burleigh in Sheffield, stainless steel changed everything. Unlike silver, it did not tarnish. Unlike iron, it did not rust. Unlike pewter, it was safe and strong. Suddenly, every home could own durable, shining forks and spoons that lasted for generations. Silver was for display, stainless steel was for daily life. Etiquette and specialization. The industrial age did not just give us more forks and spoons, it gave us more kinds of forks and spoons. The salad fork, smaller, with wider tines. The dessert fork, delicate and elegant. The fish fork, shaped for filleting. The teaspoon, for stirring sugar. The soup spoon, round and deep. The dessert spoon, larger but graceful. Victorian dining was obsessed with etiquette. A proper household might own dozens of specialized forks and spoons, each with its place. To use the wrong one was a social embarrassment. This explosion of cutlery showed that eating had become an art form, almost a performance. The spoon in daily life. In working-class homes, spoons were often the most important tool. Soup, porridge, and stews were cheap and filling, and the spoon was the daily companion of the poor. A family might own only a handful of spoons, passing them around at meals. But even then, the industrial age ensured that these spoons were stronger, cleaner, and more affordable than ever before. The fork is a symbol of progress. By the late 19th century, the fork had conquered the Western world. To eat without a fork was now considered improper, even primitive, in Europe and North America. Schools, restaurants, and military mess halls all standardized forks and spoons. Travelers from Asia or the Middle East often noted this obsession. For Westerners, forks and spoons were not just tools, they were signs of civilization itself. The colonial spread. During this same period, Europe's colonial empires carried forks and spoons to Africa, Asia, and the Pacific. In mission schools, children were taught to use forks instead of their hands. Colonial officials enforced European dining etiquette as a mark of modernity. This spread was not always welcome. Many cultures resisted. But forks and spoons nonetheless became global, even when they did not erase traditional practices. By the dawn of the 20th century, the fork and spoon had claimed their place on almost every Western table. Yet the modern world demanded more. Dining was no longer just about survival, it was about precision, elegance, and etiquette. The middle classes wanted to copy the nobility, and the wealthy wanted to outshine everyone else. So the table began to multiply with shapes and sizes of forks and spoons. There was a fork for salad, a fork for fish, a fork for dessert. A spoon for soup, a spoon for pudding, a spoon for tea, and another for coffee. In grand homes, dozens of different utensils gleamed in order, each one meant for a particular dish. To know which fork to pick up first was the mark of a refined gentleman or lady. Hotels, cruise ships, and restaurants joined the trend. Formal dining became a stage play, every fork and spoon a prop. A guest might sit before a dozen pieces of silverware, and the wrong choice could bring embarrassment. Etiquette guides were written, teaching people which spoon stirred tea and which spoon scooped custard. But outside the ballrooms and mansions, life was simpler. In working homes, the spoon remained the most faithful tool. It fed children porridge, stirred sugar into tea, carried soup to tired mouths. The fork was used for meat and vegetables, but the spoon carried daily life. Then came a new invention, disposable cutlery. With the rise of fast food, picnics, and packaged meals, cheap plastic forks and spoons flooded the world. They were light, easy, and convenient. For the first time, eating tools were not built to last a lifetime, they were built to be thrown away. Airplanes carried them in packets. Cafeterias stacked them by the hundreds. Plastic forks and spoons became symbols of modern speed, but also of waste. Unlike silver or steel, they piled into landfills, creating new problems for the earth. Yet the image of the modern table remained powerful. Stainless steel cutlery sets became wedding gifts, displayed in boxes lined with velvet. A full set of matching forks and spoons was a sign of respectability. To host guests without them was shameful. And so, by the mid-20th century, the fork and spoon had not only become universal, they had become standards. In schools, hospitals, ships, and homes across Europe, America, and much of the world, a fork and spoon were expected. The story had moved from sacred spoons of Egypt and scandalous forks of Venice, to the neatly lined silverware of the modern dining table. But the journey was not finished. The future would bring new questions, new designs, and new values. Could forks and spoons adapt to a world that demanded both tradition and sustainability? Across centuries, forks and spoons became more than just tools. They turned into symbols, woven into language, art, and belief. The spoon carried blessings. In Europe, a silver spoon given to a newborn meant wealth and protection. To say someone was born with a silver spoon in their mouth meant they entered life with privilege. In fairy tales, the humble wooden spoon belonged to peasants, a mark of simplicity and honesty. In contrast, the fork often symbolized suspicion. In its early days, the church condemned it, calling it the devil's tool. Its sharp prongs reminded people of pitchforks and hellfire. For centuries, the fork carried whispers of arrogance, danger, even evil. Yet in time, it transformed into a mark of refinement, proof that manners had triumphed over raw instinct. Artists painted forks and spoons not only as table objects, but as signs of class. Still life paintings of the Dutch Golden Age showed gleaming silver cutlery beside rich fruit and wine, reminders of wealth and power. In literature, poets and novelists used spoons as symbols of care, feeding the sick, serving the poor, while forks appeared in metaphors of conflict and sharpness. Even in politics, forks and spoons appeared. Colonial officers taught them as civilized tools, judging those who ate with hands or chopsticks as backward. At the same time, resistance to the fork or spoon became a defense of identity. To eat with bread in the Middle East, to eat with fingers in India, to use chopsticks in China, these acts declared culture stronger than foreign influence. In modern times, the fork and spoon became global icons. Fast food chains placed plastic versions in billions of meals. Protesters against waste held up biodegradable spoons as symbols of change. Designers made gold-plated forks for kings and edible spoons for eco-warriors. But through all of it, the symbolism remained clear. The spoon, nurturing, soft, generous. The fork, sharp, ambitious, powerful. Together, they told the story of humanity's struggle between need and refinement, survival and ceremony, earth and culture. The story of the fork and spoon has always been about change. From shells and bones, to silver and steel, to plastic and beyond. But the future promises new transformations, born from necessity, technology, and imagination. Already, the world is shifting. Plastic forks and spoons, once symbols of convenience, have become symbols of waste. Mountains of disposables choke the oceans. Landfills overflow with broken cutlery. And so, a new generation looks for answers. Some answers are simple. Bamboo forks and spoons, light and strong, return to nature when discarded. Edible spoons, baked from grain, let you eat your utensil along with your meal. Restaurants experiment with biodegradable starch, seaweed, even compressed leaves. Each invention whispers the same message: tools must feed us without harming the earth. Technology joins the table too. Designers create 3D printed forks, tailored to the hand of the user. Hospitals test spoons that help patients with tremors, steadying themselves with sensors. In laboratories, engineers imagine utensils that heat, cool, or even flavor food as they touch it. And then there is the dream of automation. In Japan and Korea, robots already serve meals. One day, utensils may merge with machines, spoons that lift themselves, forks that twirl pasta automatically, tools guided by AI to feed the elderly, the disabled, even the lonely. Yet the future may also turn backward. In many places, people return to traditional methods, eating with hands, chopsticks, or bread. They seek not technology, but authenticity. In an age of speed, to eat with fingers may once again feel holy, intimate, human. So the fork and spoon face two destinies. One of innovation, eco-friendly, high-tech, endlessly inventive. Another of tradition, rejecting tools for the closeness of hand to food. Either way, they remain what they have always been, silent witnesses of civilization. The meal begins, the meal ends, and the tools tell the story of who we are. From the first cave fires to the glowing lights of modern cities, the fork and spoon have been there. At first, only shells, sticks, and stones. Later, wooden spoons carved by hand, silver spoons blessed at baptism, forks whispered about as sinful, then celebrated as refined. They crossed empires. They crossed oceans. They sat in the hands of kings, priests, soldiers, farmers, children. They fed the hungry, marked the wealthy, and carried rituals of faith. The spoon, gentle, round, nurturing. The tool of mothers, healers, and caretakers. The fork, sharp, ambitious, once feared, later embraced as the mark of modern manners. Together, they shaped the very meaning of dining. They taught us that eating was not only survival, but culture. Not only hunger, but community. Not only food, but identity. They mirrored humanity's journey. From simplicity to complexity. From tradition to invention. From the sacred to the everyday. And now, as we step into the future, facing questions of waste, technology, and sustainability, the fork and spoon wait again to change with us. Perhaps they will become edible, or digital, or vanish as people return to their hands. Perhaps they will last forever, shining steel beside a plate. But whatever the future holds, one truth remains. Every time we lift a fork, every time we scoop with a spoon, we hold in our hands the history of civilization itself.